Hello, my name is Matt, host of the Pirate History Podcast. Pirates rank among the most mythologized and romanticized of all historical figures. It can become easy to forget that pirates were real people that had real-world concerns. If you like tales of high-seas adventure, daring do, and also want to learn more about who Blackbeard supported to be king, you can learn more about all of that at the Pirate History Podcast.
What did it take to survive an ancient siege?
Why was the cult of Dionysus behind so many slave revolts in ancient Rome?
What's the tragic history and mythology behind Japan's most haunted ancient forest?
We're Jen
And Jenny
from Ancient History Fangirl. Join us to explore ancient history and mythology from a fun, sometimes tipsy perspective.
Find us at ancienthistoryfangirl.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey everyone, this is Scott. Before I start the episode, I wanted to do a bit of housekeeping. First, I wanted to take a minute to promote one of my very favorite podcasts. David Crowther has been creating the amazing History of England podcast for going on 14 years. During that time, he's produced no less than 400 episodes, covering everything from the loss of Roman control right down to his current absolutely top-notch episodes on the English Civil War. His presentation style is totally delightful, and his knowledge of English history is unmatched. So do yourself a favor and check out the History of England podcast. Here's a few words from David.
Hello everyone, my name is David Crowther and I'm here to tell you about my History of England podcast, a chronological retelling of the story of the English from start to finish. There's all the great events, politics, drama, bit of bloodletting here or there, and also how the English lived, worked and played, and some of their better gags, and the all-important context of the times they lived in. The History of England can be found on a good podcatcher near you, or even some bad ones, and at thehistoryofengland.co.uk.
The second bit of housekeeping is I wanted to let you know that Google Podcasts is going away and transitioning to YouTube Music. So if you want to listen to The Ancient World on YouTube Music, you can find it at Ancient World Podcast. No spaces, with the first letter of each word capitalized. Lastly, I thought it might be good to help you make sense of the alphabet soup that the Ancient World podcast feed has become, especially for any new listeners out there. So, quick and dirty, the original series, episodes 1 through 36, covered human civilizations across the globe between around 3200 and 500 BC. Next was the Rediscovery series, episodes R1 through R10, covering the rediscovery of many of those civilizations in the modern era. Next was the Bloodline series, episodes B1 through B54, that followed the descendants of Cleopatra and Mark Antony across 10 generations of Roman history. Then was the Thea series, episodes T1 through T18, covering the life and death of the Ptolemaic princess and Seleucid queen Cleopatra Thea. Most recently was the Carchemish series, episodes C1 through C30, covering the rise and fall of the Iron Age Neo-Hittite kingdoms. Scattered among these other series were occasional spotlight episodes, flagged with an S, covering a variety of topics. Which brings us to today's episode S7, so technically my 7th spotlight episode. Make sense? I hope so. With all that out of the way, let's get things started. Whenever I travel to some ancient site, people always ask me, are you going to use that in your podcast? And I mean, yeah, sure, in general, in that I'm sure it'll contribute to a broader understanding of history and give me new visuals and tidbits and fun historical rabbit holes to go down. But also, no, I mean, I'm not doing a travel podcast or interviewing local experts. Maybe I should, but it's never really been my thing. Well, all that's by way of prologue, because from this moment onward, I'll be able to look people squarely in the eye and answer with a straightforward yes. Because I am currently living in the lovely seaside city of Thessaloniki, Greece, and I've decided to celebrate that fact by telling the story of one of the city's favorite sons, the Roman Emperor Galerius. I may eventually take on Cassander too, but that'd be a much bigger effort. Anyway, Galerius should be kind of fun because he helps me fill in a gap toward the end of the Bloodline series, where I kind of jumped thematically from Aurelian to Constantine. I'll start by admitting that calling Galerius a favorite son of Thessaloniki is a bit misleading, because he wasn't actually born there. We can attribute that knowledge and much of what we know about Galerius to a contemporary superfan named Lactantius. And of course, when I say superfan, I'm being insanely facetious, because, well, let me just give you how he introduces Galerius in his work on the deaths of the Persecutors. Galerius was worse than all the bad princes of former days. In this wild beast, and again, that's Galerius he's talking about, there dwelt a native barbarity and a savageness foreign to Roman blood. By the way, knocking down Galerius while puffing up Rome is that fine line you have to walk when you're embedded in the fairly savage court of Constantine the Great. So yeah, Lactantius is a Christian convert, much like the Emperor Constantine himself, and has nothing but shade for the previous pagan emperors, especially those who persecuted Christians. And Galerius 100% fits that bill. So Lactantius goes out of his way to stress that Galerius's mother was born beyond the Danube, and it was an inroad of the Carpi that obliged her to cross over and take refuge in New Dacia. That sentence actually packs quite a bit. Dacia Traiana, the Dacia notoriously conquered by the Emperor Trajan between 101 and 106 AD, lay on the far side of the Danube, in the region of modern Romania. But by the time of Galerius's birth, around 253 AD, invasions and raids by local tribes were making it hard to defend, which is why Galerius's mother Romula fled south across the Danube into what was then Lower Moesia. And it was there, in the city of Serdica, the modern Bulgarian capital of Sofia, that she gave birth to tiny baby Galerius. We don't have any contemporary photos, but I'm sure he was totally cute. The bulk of Galerius's formative years took place in the reign of Gallienus. And I'm sorry, let the haters go right on hating, but IMHO, Gallienus was an incredibly hard-working emperor. He was basically the James Brown of the crisis of the 3rd century. Though I'm not sure he had a cape. He probably had a cape. But despite his best efforts, the empire was rapidly breaking apart and under assault on all fronts. After his death in 268, and the brief reigns of the brothers Claudius Gothicus and Quintilian, we finally land in 270 AD with the advent of the Emperor Aurelian. So everyone take a nice deep breath, because Daddy Aurelian, he gonna make everything all right. Even as I read that line in my horrible faux Louisiana accent, I remembered that there's actually a link. New Orleans is named after Orléans, France, which itself was named after, you guessed it, the Emperor Aurelian. Connections, people, it is all about connections. Anyway, at the time he took power, old Hand on Hilt was 56 years old, while our young Galerius was 17. But they did have one thing in common. Aurelian had also been born in Moesia, right on the banks of the Danube. And he likely knew from hard experience that the only way to save the limb was to sever the gangrenous thumb. So, in his first few years on the throne, Aurelian pulled back the imperial frontier and abandoned the province of Dacia. In propagandistic compensation, he took a chunk of Upper and Lower Moesia and renamed it Dacia Aureliana, or as Lactantius calls it, New Dacia. Or, as Mike Duncan put it, see, we didn't lose Dacia, there it is, right there on the map. Actually, Aurelian's New Dacia was divided into two provinces, Dacia Ripensis along the Danube, and Dacia Mediterranea further south. And pop quiz, what did he pick for the capital of Dacia Mediterranea? You guessed it, it was Galerius's birthplace of Serdica. It's around this time that we can segue from a montage of the young Galerius as a local herdsman to a montage of him joining the army. Maybe pull some mental imagery from Officer and a Gentleman or Full Metal Jacket or one of your other favorites. Of his subsequent decades in the Roman legions, we only have a single stray line from Gibbon. That Galerius was trained to arms in the severe school of Aurelian and Probus. Given the predilections of both those emperors, Galerius likely saw plenty of action. Did he march with Aurelian to defeat the Palmyrines and capture Queen Zenobia? Or help force the surrender of the renegade Tetrarchus to reclaim the old Gallic Empire? We have absolutely zero idea, but they're certainly both possibilities. And that's just under the Emperor Aurelian, who was killed in 275. After which there's at least some evidence that his widow, Ulpia Severina, may have ruled as sole empress, until the army allowed the Senate to elevate one of their own, Marcus Claudius Tacitus, who was likely assassinated around 6 months later and succeeded by his stepbrother Florianus, who was killed by his own troops around 3 months later while confronting the revolt of the commander of the East, a career army officer named Probus. The Historia Augusta has a good synopsis of Probus's 6-year reign. Probus ruled a world to which he brought perfect peace by destroying barbarian tribes and by destroying also the very many pretenders who arose in his time. Probus was indeed a very busy bee. Goths, Germans, Vandals, the Blemmies of Egypt. He never met a tribe that he wasn't happy to fight, defeat, and either annihilate outright or compel to serve as auxiliaries. He also put down at least 4 revolts, more than any other emperor since Gallienus. His reign was a time of relative stability, but it didn't survive his death. Which brings us to Probus's successor and likely assassin, his former Praetorian prefect, Carus. Despite only ruling for less than a year, Carus also got around. First fighting, defeating, annihilating, and enslaving tens of thousands of Quadi and Sarmatians, then marching across Thrace and Anatolia to make war on the Sasanian Empire. Which is a bit of a record scratch, and I guess a sign of imperial health that Rome once again felt up to fighting the Persians. In fact, the last invasion of the Persian Empire had been under our old friend the Palmyrene Dux Odenathus way back in 266 AD. Even Aurelian hadn't tangled with the Persians when he'd come to depose Queen Zenobia. And after Palmyra's total destruction, he'd installed the Palmyrenes' longtime rivals, the Tanuk, to man the forts, patrol the desert, and defend the Roman frontier. So Carus's 283 campaign wasn't about recovering territory, since no territory had really been lost. What it was about, and this is hardly novel, was taking advantage of Sasanian weakness to top up imperial accounts. In other words, plunder and slaves. And, well, let's be honest, Persicus Maximus always has a nice ring to it. The reason the Persian Empire was weak was mainly internal divisions. The current King of Kings, Bahram II, was not only dealing with religious turmoil, but facing down two rebellions. One by his brother Hormizd, and another by a former vassal far to the east, named Hormizd Kushan Shah. All of which left his western flank fairly vulnerable to Roman invasion. The Historia Augusta relates that with the vast array and all the forces of Probus, Carus set out against the Persians, and without opposition he conquered Mesopotamia, and advanced as far as Ctesiphon. And while the Persians were busied with internal strife, he won the name of conqueror of Persia. But, and my friends, in the Roman 3rd century there is always a but. When Carus advanced still further, desirous himself of glory, he met his death. According to some, by disease, according to others, through a stroke of lightning. Actually, the Persian king Bahram II later took some personal credit. A royal relief at Nakshi Rustam shows Bahram II on horseback, victorious over two enemies. The first one trampled beneath his horse, and the second taking a blow from his lance. The trampled figure is likely the Emperor Carus. On Carus's death, the empire fell to his two surviving sons, Carinus in the west and Numerian, who'd accompanied his father to the east. Except, as the eastern army marched back to Rome, Numerian mysteriously died. Like, even more mysterious than his father's death by lightning strike. Like, anyone know what that smell is coming from the royal litter? Because it's putting me off my cacio e pepe. Oh, I see, it's the rotting corpse of our co-Augustus Numerian. Which was inconvenient and fairly gross, but more importantly, now that he's dead, who's going to take the reins? Funny you should put it that way, because, as it happens, it was the commander of the elite imperial cavalry. After putting himself forward, the former consul and governor of Moesia accepted the army's acclamation to become the new Roman emperor. His name was, or soon would be, Diocletian. Diocletian was a usurper, but let's be honest, everyone since Severus Alexander'd technically been a usurper. And that's only if you consider the Severans the legitimate successors of the Antonines. In Diocletian's case, he was technically a usurper because the current legitimate Roman emperor was Carus's surviving son, Carinus. And when the armies of the two sides clashed, Carinus looked poised to triumph. But then, suddenly, he died of natural causes. Natural causes in the 3rd century, meaning that he was assassinated. Which left Diocletian unopposed to run the whole shebang. By the time this happened, in 285, Galerius had been serving in the Roman legions for roughly a dozen years. We have no idea what role he played, if any, in the brief civil war. But considering his near-term career trajectory, it's reasonably likely he'd back Diocletian in some fairly notable way. one that put him on the new emperor's short list. 4 people short, to be precise, a kind of, I don't know, let's call it a tetrarchy. Now, don't get me wrong, the tetrarchy didn't happen overnight. Right off the bat, Diocletian and the Roman army were embroiled in conflicts with the Marcomanni, Quadi, and Sarmatians. And given the critical state of the empire, he decided to share the load. Not with Galerius, at least not yet, but with another long-term ally. As Gibbon relates, Diocletian gave himself a colleague in the person of Maximian, on whom he bestowed at first the title of Caesar and afterward that of Augustus. Maximian served a few vital roles. First, he was widely considered to be the better general. As Gibbon puts it, war was the only art that he professed. He was also an effective hatchet man. Insensible to pity and fearless of consequences, Maximian was the ready instrument of every act of cruelty which the policy of Diocletian might at once suggest and disclaim. Basically, bad cop to Diocletian's good cop, allowing his boss to keep his hands clean. Though the fearless of consequences part would eventually come round to bite him. So Maximian out west, while Diocletian returned to the east, possibly with Galerius in tow. In 287, while based in Caesarea Maritima on the Levantine coast, Diocletian received emissaries and gifts from the Persian king Bahram II. Both parties wanted peace, security, and a stable frontier, at least for the reasonably short term. And since Bahram was in the weaker position, he offered Diocletian a generous concession: the whole frickin' kingdom of Armenia. I touched on this scenario a bit in the final episode of the Bloodline series. As I mentioned back then, by 287, Bahram II's uncle, Narsa, had been ruling Armenia for 17 years. So it's a pretty safe bet that he wasn't too pleased with Bahram's gratuitous handover. Who was very happy was the surviving heir of the former Arsacid ruling house, who'd been raised in Rome and was quickly installed as King Tiridates III of Armenia, or at least of part of Armenia. Diocletian broke off a western chunk to create a new Roman province. The next few years saw campaigns against the Alemanni across the Rhine, in coordination with Maximian, and against the Sarmatians across the Danube. Which brings us to the critical year of 293 AD. As Gibbon puts it, this was the year that Diocletian decided the empire, assailed on every side by the barbarians, required on every side the presence of a great army and of an emperor. So another round of imperial mitosis, and what was once 2 became 4. 2 Augusti, Diocletian and Maximian, and 2 subordinate Caesars, Constantius Chlorus in the west, and, ta-da, our very own Galerius in the east. This is the dawning of the age of Galerius, age of Galerius. Sorry, but not really. The Tetrarchy, oh my god, what a horrible idea. One that only a ruler with no sons could ever contemplate. But we'll get into all that. Now, this was partly proactive succession planning, and partly a response to the fact that Maximian had screwed the pooch with his handling of a Gallic rebellion. Once Constantius Chlorus was assigned the task, the revolt was eventually suppressed. We know a fair amount of Constantius's background. A long career of military service, former governor of Dalmatia, praetorian prefect under Maximian, and husband of Maximian's daughter, Theodora. We know much less about Galerius's activities in the run-up to his big promotion. Again, it's safe to assume tons of military experience, particularly in the East, and a fair amount of tightness with Diocletian, whom he may have served as Praetorian prefect. We also know that the 40-year-old Galerius was married to Diocletian's daughter, Valeria. So easy peasy, fairsy squaresies, all one big happy royal family. At some point, it's not quite clear when, Galerius chose, or was assigned, his own tetrarchal capital. While Diocletian chose Nicomedia, not Rome, by the way, Diocletian hated Rome, Galerius initially took Sirmium, the capital of Lower Pannonia. But a few years later, he relocated to Thessaloniki, capital of the Roman province of Macedonia, as well as my current, albeit temporary, place of residence. Let's get it out of the way. Thessaloniki is a mouthful, but it's also an interesting story. After winning a critical battle in Thessaly with the help of local Thessalian cavalry, King Philip II of Macedonia named his daughter either the Victory in Thessaly or Victory of the Thessalians, either way, Thessaloniki. Of course, being Philip II's daughter made Thessaloniki the younger half-sister of Alexander the Great. Much younger, in fact. She was only 6 when he left to conquer the Persians. But following the early death of her own mother, she was likely raised by Alexander's mother, Olympias. After Alexander's death in Babylon, Thessaloniki, along with Olympias, Alexander's Bactrian widow Roxana, and their son Alexander IV, were besieged in Pydna by the Macedonian regent Cassander. When the city fell, Cassander killed Olympias, just as he'd later kill Roxana and the young Alexander IV. And since I've recently visited the latter's tomb, I'll post some pictures. Thessaloniki he did not kill, but instead decided to marry, mainly to forge a tie with Alexander's line. Shortly after they were wed, Cassander founded a brand new city and named it after his wife, which made Thessaloniki the very first city to be named for a Macedonian woman. You can use that to beat your friends on trivia night. Roughly a century and a half later, the Romans defeated the last Macedonian king, Perseus, in the 168 BC Battle of Pydna. In the decades following, Rome annexed the territory and constructed a major new road, connecting Dyrrhachium on the Adriatic coast with their eastern possession of Byzantium. The road was called the Via Egnatia, named after the Roman proconsul of Macedonia, Gnaeus Egnatius, and it ran right through the Aegean coastal city and provincial capital of Thessaloniki. In fact, it's still the main street running through the city today. By the time Galerius arrived in the city, Thessaloniki already boasted a Roman theater and forum. But as his new capital, it'd eventually host a massive imperial complex, mostly sited between the Via Egnatia and the waterfront. Along with a truly enormous hippodrome, it featured a basilica, baths, an apsidal hall, and an octagonal audience chamber or throne room. It's from an arch in the throne room that we have one of our best surviving images of Galerius. I'll post a few pictures. In addition to being granted a capital, the newly minted Caesar Galerius was given his own portfolio. And I've seen several theories on exactly which provinces it contained, at least other than Macedonia. It also appears that Galerius and Diocletian sometimes swapped territories, with Galerius handling affairs in the east while Diocletian campaigned on the Danube, which was likely the case in 293 when Galerius went down to Egypt. Now, Egypt was being a pain in the butt, troublesome and disobedient. So one of Galerius's first acts as Caesar was putting down a revolt in the cities of Busiris and Coptos, for which he later adopted the titles of Egyptiacus Maximus and Thebaicus Maximus. But the bigger problem for Caesar Galerius was recent developments in Persia, which is where I'll leave things off for this episode. Next time, we'll follow Galerius's eastern adventures in conflicts that will almost break, but eventually make, his budding imperial career. We'll also discuss an imperial policy that may have seemed reasonable at the time, but was fairly disastrous in hindsight: the persecution of the Christians. We'll cover Diocletian's retirement, Galerius's brief tenure as king of the world, and the total collapse of the Tetrarchy. And we'll touch on Galerius's ultimate end, one sufficiently steeped in pain and horror to satisfy even Lactantius. All this next time on The Ancient World. The Ancient World podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network, along with My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, the Explorers podcast, and other great shows.